Hey, shalom, 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 lakam, which is peace unto you all. Hayawam tawabla atam, za'achikam yawam on Rachagado, Charlotte, which is good day. This is your brother Yawam from the GMS camp in Charlotte. Nachamatam, kaya hamalakat hashamayim kwara, repent ye for the kingdom of heaven in hand, call halayim la la apanawa Yahweh bahasham Yahweh shai, bahasham rocha wamashanala zapanim nawa, wamala akim sharochagadov, which is all praises to our Father Yahweh, which means he exists, bahasham. In the name Yahweh Shai delivers in double honors to the elders and apostles of Great Millstone. I got this book. All right, it's entitled Principles of Business Law. All right, and I wanted to read an excerpt in here and get some precepts. And it was pretty much a topic, just on my spirit, just pretty much, just going into business. All right, because the scriptures essentially illustrate how we're supposed to conduct business. All right, and how we conduct business is also is an exemplification as to how we conduct ourselves and our overall character. All right, so I just want to read this real fast. It says, the Bible discusses business matters because daily work, trade, and money deeply affect human character, community care, and honoring the Most High. It says it treats commerce not as separate from faith, but as a major part of practical life, requiring honesty, fairness, and wise stewardship. And I want a trip, pretty much, when I got to, fellowship with the brothers down in Orlando, beautiful brothers. But pretty much, the head brother, pretty much went into how, how we spend our money is an exemplification as to, who we are as people. All right, because when you look at Jake, that's pretty much in the world, they spend their money on bullshit. All right, whereas us in this truth, we have been cultivated to essentially spend our money very very stringently. All right, and when we do spend money, all right, ultimately we do it on things that's beneficial in the spirit. All right, so it says moral and ethical guidance. All right. It says passages in Proverbs and the law forbid false scales and dishonest weights demanding truth in trade. All right, let's get this real fast. This is Proverbs chapter chapter 16, and we'll get verse 11. And it says, a just weight and balance are the Lord's, all the weights of the bag are his work. All right. It says, it is abomination to kings to commit wickedness, for the throne is established in righteousness. By righteousness. All right. And as it mentions in Bonsarat, the 10th chapter, pretty much the land, roughly paraphrasing, the land essentially is going to, actually, I'm going to go to it. This is Proverbs Bonsarat chapter 10, and we'll get verse, let me see. Verse 1, it says, a wise judge will instruct his people, but the government of a wise judge will instruct his people, but the government of a prudent man is well ordered. And the government of a prudent man is well ordered. All right. In which a wise judge, all right, the Lord Yahweh Bahasham Yahweh Shai ultimately instructs us, all right, through this word. It says, in the government of a prudent man is well ordered. All right. When we look at how, America, Babylon the Great ultimately runs things, all right, it's not in prudence. All right. It's not well ordered. All right, so that's what's exemplified. All right, and the people is spending their money on bullshit. All right, bread and circus. All right, things that ultimately don't, cultivate any type of righteousness. All right, verse 2, it says, as the judge of the people is himself, so are his officers, and what manner of man the ruler of the city is, such are all they that dwell therein. All right, and people in in the Senate offices and those in higher up positions, all right, they give off this facade as if, they are ultimately for a just cause, after a righteous cause, but really they not. All right. We see them spending money on drugs, all right, trafficking, and so on and so forth. All right. And that's what we see on a smaller scale, all right, with the masses of the people. But it says an unwise king destroyeth his people, but through the prudence of them which are in authority, the city shall be inhabited. All right. And true prudence, all right, is with just weights and just balances. All right, let's get this real fast. This is Proverbs 11 and verse 1. It says, a false balance is abomination to the Lord, but a just weight is his delight. So a just weight, all right, and going into just is going into what's right. All right. And it says just, shalom, it says complete, peaceful, perfect, whole. All right. Because when we look at how business is ran, how the law is ran, how society is ran, it's through unjust means. All right. It's ran to benefit those that are ultimately in power, and also to benefit those that are in cahoots with those that are in power. All right. So I'm gonna also read this right here. This is the excerpt from that book, but it says the subject matter of this text is business law. Before starting the study of business law, one should have an understanding of our legal system, in which the scriptures essentially specifically detail as to this legal system. All right, Isaiah 59th chapter. All right, it says where our laws come from, how they are applied, how they may be changed, and the role of law in our society. All right, in which the scriptures say the Lord don't change. All right, and that's why Esau's laws and how he runs business, that's why it's unrighteous, because it's subject to change. It says also, if the business related portion of the subject is to be understood, it is essential that certain terms be defined and classifications be established in advance. Thus, the first 6 chapters of this text will be devoted to a study of sources of law, the legal system, and its procedures. In addition, there will be chapters on criminal law and torts that have a direct impact on the business community. It says, now more than ever before in our nation's history, the direct relationship between law and the problems facing our society has a direct, substantial impact upon business and its decision making processes, which it shouldn't. It should just be one standard. All right, it shouldn't be subject to change. All right, let's get this real fast. This is Isaiah chapter 59, and we'll get verse 14. And it says, and judgment is turned away backward, and justice standeth afar off, for truth is fallen in the street, and equity cannot enter. It says, yet truth faileth, and he that departed from evil maketh himself a prey. And the Lord saw it, and it displeased him that there was no judgment. All right. And true, all right, again, going into business practices, all right, how we conduct ourselves in business is an exemplification as to what type of character and what type of people we is. All right, and that's essentially why, that's what sets us apart. All right, Deuteronomy, the 7th chapter and the 6th verse. All right, the law, statutes, and commandments ultimately is what keeps us balanced. All right, and that's shown in how we conduct ourselves in business. All right, but I'm gonna read some more of this. It says, now more than ever, but skipping down, it says solutions to many of society's problems are found in laws regulating business activity. For example, the basic approach to solving the problems of air and water pollution is found in the law, and that goes back to when looking at different books like this, and I have another book going into Silent Weapons for Secret Wars, how Esau Edom ultimately runs everything. He'll put it into different sectors. All right, but really he understands that these things are ultimately connected, and that's ultimately how he sets up his society. All right, and being that he understands that everything is supposed to be in a certain balance, he throws everything out of whack by pretty much dividing everything. All right, making them into different sectors. All right, this is Psalms chapter 82. All right, and we'll get verse 5, and it says, they know not, neither will they understand. They walk on in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are out of course, and that's due to who's in rulership. All right, Esau has made it to where, all right, it's a sector of science, it's a sector of math, it's a sector of English. Or you have a business sector, you got a so-called medical sector. All right, but really these things are ultimately all together. All right, and by dividing them, all right, ultimately it puts everything in a place to where it's divided. All right, and there's no true understanding. All right, things can't be ran in equity and truth. So finishing this out, it says for example, the basic approach to solving the problems of air and water pollution is found in the law. In the area of employment, legislation now affects the hiring of employees as well as their pay and promotion, especially with regard to minority groups and women. It says, in which that's going into Jake, it says, in the field of consumer protection, new laws have been enacted regulating the debtor-creditor relationship and other matters of consumer interest. Many of the laws regulating business activity are included with materials through the text. All right, but pretty much the point. All right, Esau has a whole business sector, all right, and it's not ran in righteousness, all right. So just wanted to get some edification as to how true business is supposed to be ran, So let's get we'll get Leviticus chapter 19, and we'll get verse 9. All right, and it says sundry laws, and it says, and when ye reap the harvest of your land, thou shalt not wholly reap the corners of thy field, neither shalt thou gather the gleanings of thy harvest. All right, NLT. It says, when you harvest the crops of your land, do not harvest the grain along the edges of your fields. Do not pick up what the harvesters drop. It says, verse 10, it says, thou shalt not glean thy vineyard, neither shalt thou gather every grape of the vineyard. Thou shalt leave them for the poor and the stranger. I am the Lord your power. All right, NLT, it says, it is the same with your grape crop. Do not strip every last bunch of grapes from the vines, and do not pick up the vines that fall to the ground. Do not pick up the grapes that fall to the ground. Leave them for the poor and the foreigners living among you. I am the Lord your power. In which, in this society, all right, which just goes into those that are ultimately destitute of food, all right, in whatever capacity, all right, in which that essentially balances it out, all right. Whereas, in this society, you got people that's hungry, you see, but that leads them to, which is not correct, all right, but that leads them to, stealing, all right, lying, and so on and so forth, all right. They have to go and, seek these different benefits, all right, which those benefits ultimately put them into certain boxes to where, they have to abide by some type of wicked contract, all right. In a righteous society, all right, if one had like a vineyard, right, with, the stuff that was left over, that was supposed to be left for the poor and the strangers, all right. So it says, verse 11, it says, ye shall not steal, neither deal falsely, neither lie one to another. All right, in which, again, the law, statutes, and commandments was to the nation of Yasharala, you so-called Negroes, Latinos, Native Americans, West Indians, Haitians, and Israelite foreigners. All right. We ultimately comprise of the Lord's holy people, in which this law is ultimately sent unto us, all right, in which this ultimately it governs us, all right, and it cultivates us, you see. But in Esau society, all right, Jake is so accustomed to being unbalanced, all right, well, that places it to where, the mindset is completely different, all right. It's no longer a balanced mindset, all right, and this covers business, all right, and then this also covers character, all right. Having it to where in the Esau society, all right, it cultivates a wicked character, all right, in which it doesn't just stop at that base level, because in these different sectors, Esau Edom ultimately again cultivates a mindset of wickedness, and it's just all out chaos. I'm gonna get this real fast. This is Job chapter 10, and we'll get verse 21. And it says, before I go whence, I shall not return, even to the land of darkness and of the shadow of death. A land of darkness as darkness itself, and of the shadow of death without any order, and where the light is as darkness. So America is that place of the shadow of death, all right. It's the place of that darkness, all right. And that darkness goes into ignorance, misery, all right. And actually, let's get it. This word for darkness, it says chashak, or excuse me. Right here it says actually this word is apal, and it says gloom. It says spiritual unreceptivity, calamity, obscurity, all right, in which those go into misery as well, obscurity, not being able to see the bigger picture, not being able to see spiritually, not being able to see good, all right, because it says privily, all right. It says misery, misfortune, all right. So that's what's on the minds of the people, misfortune, so people have a dog eat dog type of mindset, whereas what's cultivated in righteousness, all right, running the business in righteousness, ultimately people look after one another, all right. Even in the kingdom, the heathen, they're gonna be, they're gonna be in a servitude, you see, but they're going to be in a place to where how it's gonna be ran in the kingdom, all right. They're going to be able to ultimately live, all right. On this side, everybody just surviving, all right, because because of the mindset of Esau Edom. Scriptures say that his tongue walketh through the earth, all right, which that goes into what he pushes, his laws and legislations, But it says, verse 22 again, it says, a land of darkness as darkness itself, and of the shadow of death without any order, and where the light is as darkness, so it's not ultimately any type of order. People spend money how they want to spend it, all right. Nobody ultimately has people don't really have savings like that, all right. People don't put money aside for a rainy day, all right. to ultimately conduct business, all right, one has certain one has to have live after a certain type of lifestyle, all right, that is conducive to Esau Edom's society. All right. So let's also get this. We'll get Deuteronomy chapter 25, all right, and we'll get verse 13, all right, because this is true business, all right. Deuteronomy 25 and 13, it says, "Thou shalt not have in thy bag diverse weights, a great and a small." It says, "Thou shalt not have in thine house diverse measures, a great and a small." It says, "But thou shalt have a perfect and just weight, a perfect and just measure that shalt thou have, that thy days may be lengthened in the land which the Lord thy power giveth thee." It says, "For all that do such things and all that do unrighteously are an abomination unto the Lord thy power." And that's ultimately why the Lord is doing that role reversal. All right, let's get that real fast and we'll come back to this. But this is Bon Sirach chapter 10 and verse 4. It says, "The power of the earth is in the hand of the Lord, and in due time he will set one over it that is profitable." All right, so the nation of Yasha'Allah are you so-called Negroes, Latinos, Native Americans, West Indians, Haitians, and Israelite foreigners are those that are ultimately profitable. All right, starting with the Lord Yahweh Bahasham Yahweh Shai. Verse 8, it says, "Because of unrighteous dealings," all right, because again, the earth is ran in balance, all right, and it's synonymous with business. All right, the earth is a business. All right, our bodies, it's a business. All right, it's all synonymous. All right, it goes back to the scriptures. It says, "Because of unrighteous dealings, injuries, and riches got by deceit, the kingdom is translated from one people to another." All right, so being that Esau Edom ultimately ran everything in unrighteousness, all right, as it says in verse 16, all right, he's an abomination. All right, and that's why he's being taken out of rulership. All right, verse 16 again, it says, "For all that do such things and all that do unrighteously are an abomination unto the Lord Yahweh Bahasham Yahweh Shai, thy power." All right, because it's supposed to be ran in justness. All right, Esau will make it to where he's charging usury. All right, he charges usury to his own people. All right, he ultimately he has different measurements. All right, he puts it to where the law only benefit, or how he runs things, it only benefits himself. All right, whereas in a righteous society, everybody will be in their respective places and sectors. All right, and it's all going to work for the benefit of essentially the balance that the Lord ultimately set up. All right, going back to Psalms, the 82nd chapter and the 5th verse, the foundations are there for a specific reason. All right, and which the Lord ultimately is going to restore that. All right, let me get one more and that'll be it. But this is Isaiah 26, and we'll get verse 9. And it says, "With my soul have I desired thee in the night, yet with my spirit within me will I seek thee early. For when thy judgments are in the earth, the inhabitants of the world will learn righteousness." So it's been a long time since true goodness, all right, has been exemplified in the planet Earth. All right, but in the kingdom, it's ultimately going to be righteousness and perfection. You see, because the Lord ultimately is going to perfect us. All right, starting with the elect. All right, but the world is going to ultimately be ran and cultivated, and righteousness is going to be in true balance. You see, so I just want to go into that. Adoran Tazaza Banayapa. Lord's will, that was a beautiful edification to the spirit. Wadoran Tazah Atam Yashi Yawam Tawab. Lord's will, you have a good day. Wa Shalom Lakam, which is peace to you all. Shalom, shalom.